It's a corner office on the third floor of the Republic Pictures Executive Building on Radford Avenue, Studio City, California. The year is 1951. The afternoon sun is cutting through Venetian blinds at a low, western angle, throwing bars of amber light across a mahogany desk the size of a small raft. There are two men in the room. One of them is sitting. One of them is standing. The man sitting behind the desk has just slid a piece of paper across the polished wood surface. On that paper is a number, a single figure, written in ink, that would take most American workers 12 years to earn. $1 million. Added to an already generous contract. Added as a bonus. A gift. An incentive. Call it what you want. The man standing is 6 feet 4 inches tall. He weighs 225 pounds. His hands are resting at his sides, not clenched, not moving, not fidgeting. He is looking at the paper. He hasn't touched it. He has not said a word. The executive across the desk is watching him with the particular stillness of a man who believes he already knows the answer. Because in 1951, in Hollywood, California, nobody said no to $1 million. Nobody. That number didn't exist in polite conversation. That number could buy a man 3 houses, a fleet of cars, and 20 years of silence. That number had ended negotiations across this industry before they'd even properly begun. John Wayne looked at the paper for 4 seconds. Then he looked up, and what he said in the next 30 seconds would echo through the careers of the people in that room, and through the philosophy of every man who ever worked alongside him, for the rest of the 20th century. This is that story. To understand what happened in that office on that Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1951, you have to understand exactly what Republic Pictures was, what it wanted, and why it believed it held every card in the deck. Republic Pictures had been built on westerns. Founded in 1935 through the merger of several smaller studios, it had spent the better part of 2 decades manufacturing the American mythology of the frontier, cheap, fast, and with a commercial efficiency that the larger studios quietly envied. By 1951, Republic had produced over 900 pictures. 900. The lot on Radford Avenue in Studio City sprawled across 72 acres, with 9 sound stages, its own scoring studio, and a back lot that doubled as Monument Valley for directors who couldn't afford the gas to drive to Utah. The studio was not glamorous. It was functional. It was a machine, and the machine made money. Herbert Yates ran that machine. Herbert J. Yates had been in the film business since the silent era. He was 71 years old in 1951, a compact, sharp-featured man with the negotiating instincts of someone who had spent 4 decades watching talent come and go and understanding, with absolute clarity, that talent was a commodity. He had a gift for identifying men on the rise and locking them into contracts before the rest of Hollywood understood what they were looking at. He had done it with Gene Autry. He had done it with Roy Rogers. And in the late 1930s, after a string of other studios had cycled Wayne through bit parts and B-picture obscurity, Yates had taken a chance on a lanky, soft-spoken kid from Winterset, Iowa, and built him into the Western star the industry had been waiting for. By 1951, that investment had paid off in ways Yates could measure precisely. Wayne had become Republic's most bankable asset. His pictures returned an average of 4.7 times their production cost. His name above the title of a Western added an estimated $800,000 in pre-release theatrical bookings before a single frame was screened. He was, in the language of studio accounting, a multiplier. And Yates knew how to treat multipliers. You kept them close. You kept them grateful. And when another studio came calling, as they increasingly were by 1951, with Paramount and RKO and Warner's all beginning to circle Wayne with serious money and serious pictures, you offered them something that made walking away feel like a moral failure. $1 million. That's what was on the table this particular Tuesday in May of 1951. $1 million added to Wayne's existing deal, in exchange for a renegotiated exclusivity clause that would bind him to Republic for an additional 4 years. The offer was not unusual in its structure. Yates had used similar arrangements to retain Gene Autry after a contract dispute in 1938 and to keep Roy Rogers from jumping to Columbia in 1945. What was unusual was the size of the number. $1 million incentive clause was, in 1951, the kind of figure that generated its own gravitational field. It pulled men toward it. It rearranged priorities. It made previously non-negotiable things negotiable. But there was a condition attached. And that condition had a name. Ward Bond. Ward Bond had been John Wayne's friend since 1926. 25 years. They had met as freshman football players at the University of Southern California. Bond a roaring, barrel-chested fullback from Ben Kelman, Nebraska, Wayne a quiet, observant tackle from a nowhere town in Iowa. And from that first season on the USC practice field, they had built a friendship that operated less like a professional alliance and more like a foxhole partnership. They had done extra work together in the late silent era for $5 a day. They had eaten meals off craft service tables when neither of them had proper residences. They had ridden through Monument Valley together on Ford's early pictures, sleeping in the same bunkhouse accommodations with the rest of the hired riders, sharing cigarettes and silence in the dark outside the Utah camps. Ward Bond was not a star. He was never a star. He was a character actor of remarkable presence and considerable skill. 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds, with a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who valued function over elegance. By 1951, he had appeared in over 200 films. He had worked with John Ford, Howard Hawks, Frank Capra. He had played opposite Henry Fonda, Humphrey Bogart, Jimmy Stewart. He was, in the industry's unspoken taxonomy, a supporting presence, the kind of actor who elevated every scene he occupied without ever threatening to walk away with the picture. But Ward Bond had a reputation that traveled ahead of him like weather. He was loud. He was opinionated. He was politically outspoken during a period, the early 1950s, when political opinions in Hollywood carried professional weight that could bend careers. Bond was a founding member and active voice in the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization that had, by 1951, become deeply controversial within the industry. His associations, his public statements, his willingness to name names in a climate where naming names was both dangerous and divisive. All of it had made Ward Bond a liability in the eyes of studios and producers who were trying to navigate the gathering storm of the blacklist era without taking permanent casualties. Republic had a specific problem with Ward Bond. Not ideological. Practical. Bond was under a loose arrangement with Republic that gave him favored nation status on Wayne's pictures. A handshake understanding, originally blessed by Yates himself, that kept Bond employed on Wayne's productions as a matter of professional loyalty. By 1951, that arrangement was costing Republic more than they had anticipated, not in Bond's salary, which was modest, but in the friction his presence created. Other studios were reluctant to enter co-production arrangements that included Bond in the package. 2 distribution deals in the prior 18 months had required awkward conversations about his participation. One foreign distribution partner had quietly flagged Bond as a complicating factor in their market. Yates wanted the arrangement ended. He wanted Wayne to formally, officially, in writing, remove Ward Bond from any future favored consideration on Republic Productions. And he was willing to pay $1 million to make it happen. But here's where it changes. John Wayne had arrived at the Republic lot that Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m. This was not unusual. Wayne was constitutionally early. He had been raised by a father, Clyde Morrison, who treated punctuality as a form of respect. And Wayne had absorbed that lesson so completely that throughout his adult life he arrived at studios before the grips, before the gaffers, before the men whose entire job was to be there first and make things ready. On a picture, he would often walk the set alone in the early morning, getting the geography of the space into his body before the crew arrived and filled it with noise and intention. That morning he had spent 2 hours at Republic Stage 7 reviewing pre-production materials for his next picture. He had lunch in the studio commissary, a chicken sandwich and a glass of iced tea, at a corner table, alone, reading a script with the pages weighted flat by a coffee cup. 3 crew members who were present that day would later recall that he was entirely still while reading. Not the stillness of a man waiting for something to happen. The stillness of a man who had already decided what he was going to do when it did. At 1:15 p.m., he walked to the executive building. He was wearing work clothes, pressed khakis, a chambray shirt, leather boots that had been resoled twice. He was not dressed for a negotiation. He was dressed for a Tuesday. The executive building receptionist, a woman named Doris Heller who had worked the Republic front desk since 1943, would remember later that Wayne stopped at her desk, asked after her daughter, who had recently had her tonsils removed, and waited a full 45 seconds for her to finish a sentence before continuing down the hallway. He did not move the way other men moved. There's no other way to say it. John Wayne, at 44 years old, had a physical presence that people consistently struggled to describe accurately after the fact. It wasn't size alone, though the size was real. 6 feet 4 inches in a room of average men is a different country. It wasn't the posture, though his was particular. He carried his weight forward, over the balls of his feet, with his shoulders dropped and his chin level, a bearing that looked casual until you noticed how deliberate it was. The grip of his hands gave it away. Wayne's hands were enormous, a fact documented by every costumer, prop master, and special effects armorer who ever worked with him. And he held them loosely at his sides, fingers slightly open, the way a man holds his hands when he is ready to use them but has not yet decided whether to. He knew exactly what was waiting for him in Yates's office. 3 people in the building knew the substance of what Yates intended to discuss. None of them were named John Wayne. But Wayne had been navigating Hollywood long enough to read the temperature of a meeting before the door opened. And when Yates's assistant, a young man named Gerald Park, met him at the office, entrance and held the door with a particular quality of held-breath attention, Wayne understood something important was about to be put on a table. He said nothing. He walked in. He sat down. And then he waited for Yates to speak first. Herbert Yates was a man who understood leverage, and he deployed it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 30 years. He did not begin with the number. That was not his method. He began with context. He reminded Wayne of what Republic had been to his career. The years of investment, the pictures they had built together, the infrastructure of distribution and promotion that had taken a supporting player and made him a name above the title. He spoke for 4 minutes without interruption. His tone was collegial, even warm. He was not threatening. He was establishing a shared history, reminding Wayne of the weight of what was owed. Then he laid out the new arrangement. The additional 4 years. The exclusivity. The reasons, carefully phrased, businesslike, stripped of animus. Why the Ward bond arrangement needed to formally end. Wayne sat with his forearms on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, and listened to all of it without speaking. Yates slid the paper across the desk. $1 million. Handwritten. Initialed. Nobody in this industry would walk away from this, Yates said. He meant it as reassurance. He meant it as context. But in the quiet of that office, with the afternoon sun throwing its bars of amber light across the desk between them, what it sounded like was a test. Wayne looked at the paper for 4 seconds. His internal calculation in that moment was not financial. It was not strategic. The producer David Holt, who had been Wayne's production collaborator throughout the late 1940s and would later recount this story in private, not for publication, never for publication, described what Wayne told him afterward. That he had looked at the number and understood immediately that the number was not the point. The number was a tool. The number was being used to reframe a question about character as a question about math. And John Wayne did not solve character problems with math. He had a simple internal standard, one he had carried since the USC practice field in 1926, that went something like this. A man who will sell a friend has already told you everything you need to know about what he'd do to an enemy. 25 years. That was the arithmetic that mattered, not the number on the paper. 25 years of Ward bond standing in the gap, sharing the bad meals, writing the hard trails, showing up. Nobody in that office, nobody on that lot, nobody in that industry was going to buy that with a piece of paper and an ink number. Wayne looked up from the desk. The room went silent. Gerald Park, the assistant, was standing near the door, close enough to hear, far enough to be deniable. He would recall years later that the silence before Wayne responded lasted approximately 7 seconds. That in those 7 seconds, Herbert Yates, who had negotiated across a desk with every major name in the studio system for 3 decades, looked like a man who had just realized he had miscalculated something fundamental. Wayne did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice in situations like this. Raising your voice was a signal that you needed help, that your argument couldn't stand on its own and required volume to compensate. Wayne's voice, when he finally used it, was level and unhurried and entirely without performance. He said, "Herb, I'm not going to do that." Yates started to respond. He began a sentence about the business realities, about the distribution concerns, about the practical difficulties of the current climate and what it required of men in their positions. And Wayne said quietly, "I heard all of that. My answer's the same." A production executive named Carl Lorenz, who was waiting in the anteroom for a separate meeting with Yates and could hear the muffled shape of the conversation through the wall without making out the words, would later describe hearing a quality of silence from inside that office that he had never heard in a studio building before. Not the silence of a stalled negotiation. The silence of a thing that was finished. Yates made one more attempt. He suggested that Bond himself might appreciate a clean break. That it would free him to pursue arrangements at other studios. That Wayne holding the Bond arrangement in place might actually be limiting Bond's mobility, rather than protecting it. Wayne looked at him for a moment. "Ward can speak for Ward," he said. "This is me speaking for me." What happened in the next 12 minutes was not a confrontation in the physical sense. There were no raised voices. No furniture moved. No documents were torn. What happened was a demonstration of a different kind of force. One that Yates, for all his decades in the industry, had not encountered in quite this form before and would not encounter again. In the first minute, Wayne stood up from his chair. Not abruptly. Not with the theatrical deliberateness of a man making a point through movement. He stood up the way a man stands up when a meeting is over. With the quiet economy of someone who has completed what he came to do and sees no reason to extend the occasion. In the second minute, Yates made a final repositioning move, standard procedure in his negotiating playbook. He lowered the demand. Not the money stayed. He simply reframed the Bond clause. Not a termination of the arrangement, just a formal acknowledgement that future productions would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis rather than a standing arrangement. Functionally identical. Rhetorically softer. Wayne buttoned the top button of his chambray shirt. He had not unbuttoned it during the meeting. He buttoned it anyway, an unconscious signal, the way a man squares himself before he walks back out into the world. "That's the same thing," he said. In the third minute, something shifted in the room. Yates was a hard man, genuinely hard, the kind of hardness that comes from decades of commercial combat, from watching men's careers rise and fall and learning to feel neither particular guilt nor particular pleasure about either. But he was also, in this moment, watching something he recognized even if he could not immediately name it. He was watching a man absorb $1 million, feel its weight, understand its implications, and set it down undisturbed. Not out of ignorance of what it meant. Not out of miscalculation. Out of an understanding that some things were simply not for sale, and that clarity on that point was not a negotiating position. It was a fact about the man. Nobody on that lot moved. Gerald Park, at the door, had not blinked in 45 seconds. In the fourth minute, Wayne picked up his hat from the corner of the desk where he had set it when he sat down. A gray felt Stetson, slightly battered. The kind of hat a man wears because it works rather than because it photographs well. And he looked at Yates one final time with a quality of attention that people who knew him well would have recognized immediately. It was not a challenging look. It was not a dismissive look. It was the look of a man who wanted to make sure he was understood. Not in the sense of agreement, but in the sense of clarity. He wanted Yates to know exactly what had just happened and why, so there would be no confusion later about where the line was. "Herb," he said, "you built something real here. I know that. I'm not walking away from it. But I'm not walking away from Ward either. That's not something I'm going to do. Not for this, not for more than this." He settled the hat onto his head. Even this was not theatrical. The hat went on the way it always went on, practical, adjusting slightly for the set of his head, the brim coming to exactly the right position over his eyes. He said, "Give me a picture you want to make, and I'll make it with you. Same as always." Then he walked toward the door. Here is where it gets quiet. Yates did not respond immediately. He sat behind his mahogany desk in his corner office, with the amber light coming through the Venetian blinds, and he looked at the piece of paper on the desk between them. The one with the number on it, the one with his own initials, the one that had ended every comparable conversation he had ever been a part of. And for the first time in a very long time, Herbert Yates looked at a negotiating instrument that had simply failed to function. Not because the other party couldn't afford to walk away. Not because they had a better offer across town. Because the thing being offered, the $1 million, the career security, the industry goodwill, was less valuable to the man being offered it than what it was asking him to trade. That is not a calculation that fits in the standard columns of studio accounting. Wayne reached the door. Gerald Park opened it, slightly too quickly, the way a man opens a door when he has been holding himself still for too long. Wayne stopped in the doorway. Not to make a point, but because the next thing he had to say was worth saying precisely. He turned back slightly, not fully, just enough to be heard clearly. "Ward Bond has been on every picture I've asked for since Stagecoach," he said. "He'll be on the next one. I hope you can make that work. But if you can't, that's a conversation we can have." He walked out. The door closed behind him. Gerald Park would later estimate that the silence inside that office, after the door closed, before Yates spoke or moved or made any sound at all, lasted approximately 12 seconds. He counted them. He didn't know why. He just counted them, standing outside that door in the hallway of the Republic Executive Building, in the amber light of a Tuesday afternoon in May of 1951. 12 seconds. That's not a pause in a negotiation. That's not a man collecting his thoughts before the next move. That's a man sitting with the fact that something has just happened to his understanding of the world. 40 minutes later, Wayne was back at Stage 7. He had walked the long way, across the back lot, past the standing Western Street set with its false front saloons and its dusty Main Street hardpack, past the corral where Republic kept its working horses, past the cluster of wranglers and stunt riders who were finishing up a late afternoon rehearsal for a Gene Autry picture. He had nodded at two of them, stopped to look at a quarter horse that one of the wranglers was working through a bridle pattern, said 3 words about the horse's footwork that the wrangler, a man named Ray Corrigan Jr., would remember precisely for the next 20 years. He's reading you. He was not distracted. He was not agitated. He was processing the way he always processed difficult things, by moving through the physical world and letting it do its work on him. When he reached Stage 7, he sat down in a canvas director's chair with his name stenciled on the back. The kind of chair that has occupied every film set since the silent era, an almost absurdly simple piece of furniture. And he spent 15 minutes reviewing the pre-production binders he had left there that morning. Then Herbert Yates came to Stage 7. This was not something Yates did. Studio heads did not walk to sound stages to continue conversations. Sound stages were below the sight line of executive buildings. The power dynamic of the lot was encoded in its architecture. Executives above, talent below, the physical elevation of the building reinforcing the commercial hierarchy of who needed what from whom. Yates walked to Stage 7. He found Wayne in the canvas chair. Wayne looked up. He did not stand. Yates stood at the edge of the stage for a moment. He was a man who had spent his professional life in positions of authority and the physical vocabulary of deference. Standing while another man sits, approaching rather than waiting, cost him something real. That much was visible even to the 2 pre-production crew members who were present on the far side of the stage, pretending to organize cable. "I want to understand something," Yates said. Wayne waited. "You know what that number is," Yates said. "I know you know. So help me understand what I'm missing." It was a genuine question. That was the thing about it. The thing that Wayne would describe to David Holt, years later, as the reason he answered it straight rather than deflecting. Yates was not maneuvering. Yates was actually asking. Wayne set down the binder. "Herb," he said, "when you figured out what I was worth, when you put that number on paper in 1938, you didn't do that because you needed a favor. You did it because you saw something and you acted on it. You kept your word. I've tried to keep mine." He paused. Ward Bond has kept his. Every time I've needed someone to show up, he's shown up. Not for the credit. Not for the billing. Because that's the kind of man he is. What you're asking me to do is tell him that the 25 years of that don't count against one number on a piece of paper. He looked at Yates with the same quality of level attention he had brought to the office. No heat in it, no accusation. "I can't do that. Not because of what it does to him. Because of what it does to me. A man who sells a friend has already told you everything about himself." Yates was quiet for a moment. "Even for $1 million, he said. "Not a challenge. A confirmation. Especially for $1 million, Wayne said. "That's when it matters." The 2 pre-production crew members on the far side of the stage were not pretending to organize cable anymore. They were standing still. Yates looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something that, for a man of his temperament and professional history, was almost unprecedented. He nodded. Not the performative nod of a man agreeing in order to move a conversation forward. A real nod. The nod of a man acknowledging something he had just learned. "All right," Yates said. "We'll work with Bond." He turned and walked back toward the executive building. No handshake. No raised glass. No elaborate ceremony. Just a nod, and a man walking back across a studio lot with something new in his head that had not been there an hour before. Ward Bond was on the next picture. And the one after that. Years later, 10 years later, in the early 1960s, after Ward Bond had died of a heart attack in 1960, and the Hollywood landscape had shifted in ways that even Yates's long career had not prepared him to fully navigate. Herbert Yates would speak about John Wayne in terms that had changed profoundly from the language of studio accounting. Yates retired from Republic in 1959. The studio itself was sold and converted, eventually, into the CBS Studio Center complex that still occupies those 72 acres in Studio City today. The machine had run its course. The Western was changing. Television was changing everything. But in private conversations during his retirement years, Yates would return, occasionally, to that Tuesday afternoon. To that 40-minute silence in his corner office. To walking across the back lot to Stage 7. Something he could not fully explain to himself, even in retrospect. And hearing an answer to a question he had spent 30 years in the industry not quite knowing how to ask. He told a colleague named Arthur Rosenfeld, in a conversation Rosenfeld recounted in his unpublished memoir, that what John Wayne had taught him that afternoon was not about loyalty precisely. It was about calibration, about the fact that a man who is clear about what is not for sale is the only kind of man whose commitment means anything when he gives it. "I'd bought and sold a lot of things in that building," Yates said. "Contracts, careers, pictures. Wayne taught me there's a category that doesn't fit in the ledger. And the men who understand that category are the ones you can actually trust." Arthur Rosenfeld carried that conversation into his own career as a producer throughout the 1960s and 70s. He told it to young directors and writers who came through his productions not as a business lesson, but as a character lesson, the distinction mattering enormously to him. His assistant in the late 1970s, a young woman named Claire Aston, who went on to produce a string of significant pictures through the 1980s, would describe Rosenfeld returning to the story regularly, always with the same emphasis. Not the $1 million. Not even Ward Bond. The sentence, "A man who sells a friend has already told you everything about himself." That sentence moved through 3 generations of the industry like a thing with its own momentum. Not cited, not attributed, just present, in the way that true things tend to be present, embedded in the practical wisdom of people who never knew where they heard it. Ward Bond, in the months before his death in November of 1960, was working steadily. He was starring in Wagon Train, the television western that had become one of the most watched programs in America, reaching an audience of 30 million viewers a week. His career had not been limited by John Wayne's loyalty. It had been sustained by it, extended, elevated, carried forward into the medium that was replacing the one that had made both of them. Whether Bond ever knew what Wayne turned down for him on that Tuesday in May of 1951, whether Wayne ever told him, is not recorded anywhere. Which may be exactly the point. Return to the room. The corner office. The amber light through the Venetian blinds. The mahogany desk and the piece of paper with the number on it. The 4 seconds of looking, and then the look up. What was in John Wayne's face in that moment, in the 4 seconds before he responded, was not calculation, was not righteousness, was not performance. It was the expression of a man for whom the answer to the question on the table was so clear, so fundamentally already settled, that the 4-second pause was not hesitation. It was simply the time it took to find the right words for something that did not require words. $1 million. One friendship. One answer that never wavered. He knew what he was. He knew what that meant. He knew what it cost, and he paid it without blinking, the way a man pays a debt he considers a privilege to carry. That's not stubbornness. That's not sentimentality. That's the definition of character. Knowing your price and discovering it's higher than anything the market can offer. One decision. One man. One lesson that history almost forgot. But there was one other conversation in that exchange. One thing Ward Bond said to John Wayne the last time they spoke before Bond's death in November of 1960. That Wayne never repeated publicly. Not in any interview. Not to any journalist. Not in any of the conversations that biographers and colleagues would later try to reconstruct. Whatever passed between them in that final conversation, Wayne kept it. And the reason why, what a man of that loyalty chooses to hold sacred even after the other man is gone, that's a story for another time.